Well, look what we have here. I hope you're ready, soldier, because today we're getting off this dirty floating rock. Or at least that's the idea. As I'm sure you well remember and don't need to be reminded, but I'll do it anyway, we are about to be leaving on this ship which only needs about 5 or so more days to power up before we can get off the planet. The only problem is we still have endless waves of enemies coming for us, and we also still have many more civilians to try to rescue. I know, how brave of us, but that's just what we do, baby. But enough dilly-dallying, let's get to the action. At the end of last episode, one of our rewards ended up being a few mini turrets, one of which was actually made of Forerunner metal. Now that's important to bring up because I think that might be the strongest material that we currently have at our disposal on this planet, so it's pretty cool, to say the least. Anyhow, though, we are building some embrasures and whatnot for them to keep them safe. Not only that, but adding in these new mini turrets is also going to give us full coverage all around the entire perimeter of our makeshift base as well as the ship. For our Marines, I thought it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and start digging some ditches. That way we can not only take cover down in them where only our little heads and our shoulders are poking out, but we would also build some sandbags giving us even more coverage. However, it's important to note by giving ourselves coverage away from enemy fire, this is actually taking away our ranged coverage with our own weapons because, as one might imagine, sitting down in a hole and shooting your gun out means that you can't really hit as much. So essentially, while taking cover in these little pits and trenches, we take a significant debuff to our range, which can end up being a bit of an issue when your enemy is the combat forms of the Flood, carrying some pretty heavy firepower of their own, unfortunately. They were also coming from the west. Now, we could end up taking cover behind our sandbags and embrasures where our turrets were, but if we were to do that, we're also going to be drawing their fire towards our automated defenses, and they'll definitely end up getting destroyed, so instead we took cover behind some ruins. This way, as the combat forms crept up on the base, thinking they would get the upper hand and the jump on us, it was actually quite the contrary as we popped out and flanked them from the side. Now, would we rush out into blind fire in an open field only with the trees barely covering us, playing it fast and loose? Yes, we would. Should we have? Probably not. And this became most apparent to me when we finished off the remaining combat forms that were in the area, and I noticed that Shin had taken quite a licking due to their heavy weaponry. With burnt flesh and many a broken bone, the only thing we could do is to send him back to the base to be tended by Starry as the others finished the mission. The remaining Flood abominations in the area were simply their carrier forms and those infection forms that would burst forth from them. We quickly dispatched of these disgusting monsters, and now it was time for us to choose our reward. There were a good few options here, but of course with such limited time, and as we discussed at the end of last episode, we are going to be choosing colonists and civilians so that we can rescue them. From the sky fell a drop pod. From the drop pod burst a beautiful lady by the name of Beatrice wielding an axe, and it turns out she likes television. We wanted to make her quite comfortable since it seems like we're going to be here for a hot moment before we put her in the ship, of course. Not to worry though, she wasn't some type of freeloader, and she wouldn't just fill her days with recreational activities. No, she would also help us with constructing some steel walls around the rest of this area, protecting us furthermore, as well as helping us cut down more and more trees, as wood is a very valuable resource, and in fact, it's just the resource that we needed to make ourselves a new residential area, barracks, whatever you want to call it, to house all of our potential civilians that we're going to take into the stars with us. Well, that was the plan at least. Now, I realized we could go ahead and put them in the cryo-sleep caskets on the ship, but I wanted to keep a lot of them, as many as possible, out. That way they could help us fight these larger and larger waves coming our way. Speak of the devil, if it isn't a bunch of filthy clankers coming to kill us. Don't let these smaller looking groups fool you. There's about 12 or so of them walking in the same spot there. Unfortunately, it looks like Shin is still recovering, and then he's gonna have to sit this one out. We would end up splitting our clone Marines into two separate groups, with Hiroshi taking the eastern side and fighting his own group of filthy clankers, while Rinbin ended up taking the western side, and he ended up taking on the largest group, so we sent in some reinforcements. Eventually though, thanks to our Marines as well as some help from our autocannon, we finally finished off these metallic monstrosities, and it's time for another reward. And yes, as you guessed it, once again we are going to be choosing yet another colonist, of course, which is a shame. I really wanted some more mini turrets, but I suppose you can't put a price tag on saving the lives of the countless innocent in the area, so we can always just build our own turrets, I guess. Womp womp. Speaking of building, we would continue working on our little wooden barracks that we were working on previously in between these waves, and we were also collecting a lot of steel so that we could build more defenses and whatever else we needed realistically. And finally, the next wave of flood would arrive. The frontal assault of this wave was mostly comprised, as you could guess, of infection forms and hound forms, which wasn't much of an issue. The carrier forms, of course, being much slower, would take quite a while to arrive. And as they slowly waddled towards the base, we had a very quick bombardment hitting the entire map and setting off many a forest fire. Massive rainstorms would come in to wash away the fires that had been started. You may think this is a good thing, but this was actually a bit of a problem, because with all the rain and other factors combined, it was extremely difficult for us to fire at the teeny little infection forms. We were doing our absolute damnedest to kill them very quickly, but within the blink of an eye, a large group of them had Shin completely surrounded, ripping his armor to shreds. And this would result in Shin becoming infected by the parasite, causing extreme pain all over his entire body. But here's the funny thing, where we've seen these infections take place before, it's damn near instantaneous. For whatever reason, Shin's body was managing to push the infection out, or at least keep it at bay. Perhaps the infection form exploded before it could really take over? I don't know. Although it may have something to do with his increased blood filtration and pumping. Either way, we're just happy he hasn't turned yet. We would rush him to the nearest bed and perform emergency surgery on his nose. I don't know whether or not we surgically cut it out, or if we smashed it to bits to ensure that the infection was dead. Either way, it looks like things are going pretty smoothly now, and he should be fine. But that was indeed a close call. Unfortunately for our reward, we didn't even have a choice to have yet another colonist join us, and I really should have went with the chem fuel here, but instead I decided to go with some Archotech artifacts, as I thought we might get something useful, but not really, unfortunately. Oh well, it was a real shame we didn't have an option for another colonist, because in about less than a day or so, the ship was going to be fully powered up and ready to launch, and yet we've only managed to get about 2 or 3 civilians. Speaking of, the 2 that we currently have from our recent rewards, we decided to go ahead and put them in the cryo-sleep pods on the ship. Reason being, after what happened to Shin, I realized that it would be a really dangerous and horrible idea to have them out fighting enemies like this. If the flood could almost kill one of our clone Marines, our civilians are not safe. However, it should be noted that Starry really may not be a clone, but she has the heart of a clone Marine and a true Imperial. So we've decided to leave her out to help us fight. As this is her choice, of course, we're not forcing her to do it, but if things really get rocky, we might have to bonk her on the head and toss her in the casket. Because there's a less likely chance of us getting the option of yet another civilian joining us if we don't summon waves early, we're kind of left with no choice. Next wave is going to give us an 84% chance, so here's hoping. A decent-sized group of droids were dropping in right on top of the base. We would rush to our Goliath as well as other battle stations to fight them off as best we could, risking it all and putting our lives on the line to try to save as many folks as we possibly can, crushing electronic and metallic skulls and leaving piles upon piles of exoskeletons in our wake. They put up a decent fight, but even catching us off guard and dropping in right on top of our heads wouldn't allow them to defeat us. But even after all that, I am afraid that we still did not get our 4th reward with an 84% chance, which is pretty crazy if you ask me, but anyhow, we ended up choosing steel this time around. Either way though, we were going to have to summon our next wave ASAP. The reason being, and maybe I've explained this before, maybe I haven't, but the sooner that we summon these waves, the higher the chance of us getting a 4th reward, and thus the higher the chance of us getting more civilians, yada yada, you understand, I'm sure. For wave 14, the flood have cometh once more, with many a combat form ready to get stomped into a green mush, I hope. To start this little party off right, we started firing our mortar shells at them. Unfortunately, they weren't sitting around and preparing for battle, so it would be a little bit more difficult than we would have liked, but with our mortar and our Goliath swarm turret combined, we would end up killing quite a few of them as they were on their way here. Those few that remained were getting a little bit too close to the base for us to begin firing at them with the mortar and swarm turret, as we didn't want to risk any damage and friendly fire to ourselves, so we would send in our squad of Marines to take care of them. Not to worry though, friendos, as we were still putting the swarm turret to good use. As our Marines fought the combat forms, we were exploding the large, bulbous, waddling carrier forms, turning them into chunky Campbell's soup. However though, even so, with many of our defenses damaged or completely destroyed, the infection and hound forms would manage to get past our walls and would actually come into the center of the base, where we'd have quite a standoff with them, eventually defeating all of them. With the round green menace finally taken care of, it was time for us to yet again choose a reward, and once again, my precious mini turrets, I'm ever so sorry, but we need to save lives, and that's exactly what we intended on doing. A handsome, chiseled chin Neanderthal woman with a very large forehead with an X on it would end up arriving in a drop pod, and we immediately went ahead and put her in a cryosleep casket. Be her a silly, illiterate Neanderthal, we didn't want her wandering around in the forest looking for berries or squirrel or something, and ended up getting infected and dying, so yeah. As is the case with many of these raids, even after they're over, we still have the aftermath of the events that follow, like the orbital bombardments and meteor showers. The biggest problem here is, since we're summoning these waves early, we're getting both of those at the exact same time, meaning that we're not only having to repair our base a lot, but we're also having to put out a lot of fires. This also meant that we would have to wait a substantial amount of time before we could finally repair and reconstruct our turrets, this time around some double autocannons, I might add, because we didn't want the orbital bombardments destroying them or just damaging them, and also because we had so much other stuff to do. We are some very busy bees. Eventually though, the ship's reactor was finally at full power, and it was ready to launch at a moment's notice. I do want to point out though, I hadn't realized until later on, and I didn't really get any footage of me realizing, but the ship's AI was destroyed, I believe by an orbital bombardment, so we're gonna have to repair that before we leave. At the moment though, we do have much bigger fish to fry, like more droids coming into our area. This time I didn't actually summon them early because we just were not prepared for the next wave at all, so they were coming in on their own. We immediately began giving them the old 1-2 with some mortar shells and also some missiles from the old Goliath, and this was actually doing pretty well, killing a substantial amount of them before they even began their assault. However, it did take us a good bit of time to realize that there was a separate group of them attacking us in the southeastern quadrant of the map, so we had to focus some efforts there as well. Even with smaller groups of enemies like this, we were beginning to be spread a little bit thin, and we were starting to feel the effects of getting all these colonists and yet not using them because we didn't want them to die. As this wave was coming to an end, they were pretty sparsely dispersed all around the map, so we would actually send out our Marines to hunt down these stragglers and to finally finish them off, ending the wave once and for all. With yet another notch on our belt, it was time for us to choose our reward, and yet again the Emperor smiles upon us, giving us the choice to save yet another civilian. A nice young lady wearing nothing but a sash for whatever reason, wielding a sword and a mace with some Goldilocks hair. We immediately stashed her in yet another cryo-sleep casket, and she was safe and sound. As the end begins to draw near, we can feel it in the air, our enemies plotting against us, gigantic waves of them coming, no doubt. We tried to enjoy as much time together as we could, just in case. We would end up summoning our next wave early as well, with a 95% chance of us getting another reward option, of course, this time around once again being the Flood Pure forms, which would immediately start generating hives in the area, infesting the very land itself, corrupting, manipulating, and violating the very being of this planet. Because they're technically destroyed in the process, we could go ahead and choose our next reward, being yet another colonist, thankfully, by the name of Kayan, a bearded fellow with a bowl cut and a shotgun. I was half tempted to let him try to help us, but I knew he'd basically die very quickly in the process, so we sent him inside to hide while we would go out and start taking on these hives. Thankfully, it seems that when you catch them early like this, they're pretty easy to defeat. The only problem being there were 3 separate hives, and they were pretty far away from each other. Take that into account with the fact that the base itself was being assaulted by some tank forms and other larger forms that took quite a while to kill, though we did eventually take them down, and the 3rd and final hive had already evolved into a mass of disgusting and grotesque flesh that was quite difficult to finish. I suppose it's just a good thing we got here when we did. After stomping the hives into oblivion and burning them down to the ground, we would finally put Kayan away in his little cryo-sleep casket, and yet another fella saved, it would seem. But we still have a lot of work to do and a lot more people to try to save before we can finally leave. We actually ended up building ourselves a fabrication bench. Since we have Starry out and about, we need to give her some better armor. Now, of course, she has a lot of the legendary armor and stuff that we got through rewards, but we wanted to make her some custom clone armor, so she kind of fits the bill a bit better, huh? Now, even with this new armor, she still looked a little bit silly, as it wasn't quite as large as the marine armor that we had gotten from rewards, but it will indeed protect her, and you know what? That is top priority, okay? We also ended up having some drifters who had stopped in between our waves, as I noticed a group of folks just standing around. Now, we are trying to save civilians, and with the flood attacking, let's be realistic, like, at some point they're going to take over the planet, so we tried to do them the favor of arresting them and then forcing them into the cryo-sleep caskets, but most of them fought back, and we accidentally ended up crushing their skulls. Oopsie poopsie, it would seem that we're a little bit stronger than we might have thought. Although all was not lost, as we did end up saving one of the Outlanders. Now the others, I mean, you can blame me if you want, blame us all, but realistically, it's their fault for not just getting in and making us hit them, okay? Resisting a soldier of the Empire is against the law, and the punishment can be death, so we were well within our rights. Alright, I don't want to see you in court. Anyway, though, the next wave is finally here, and once again, it is a bunch of droids, a variety pack of them, it would seem. This should be quite fun. Their biggest mistake was preparing before the invasion, as this would give Hiroshi enough time to sneak up on them and begin unleashing our mega weapon. I think they really felt the heat off of that one, if you know what I'm saying. There was about a handful or so of them left. They started coming towards the base, and we easily finished them off. The Emperor sends his blessings once more to his people across the entire universe, as we had a tribesperson this time around that we would be able to rescue, stuff her into a teeny tiny steel box that gets very cold so she can sleep, and she is good to go. Finally, Wave 18 was just around the corner, and with a 97% chance of getting 4 rewards, you know we had to take it, even though we were facing just under 200 enemies in total. This was about to become our most dangerous, most difficult battle to date. As the ominous hordes of Flood began to approach, we would use one of our last total dominating weapons, a tornado generator. This unfortunately would not be near as effective as the orbital beam targeter and bombardment targeters, but at the moment, it's the best we got. The tireless, endless hordes began making their way through our sacred walls. We could see their grimy, disgusting little tentacles ripping and tearing through the dirt as they made their way. We began a retreat towards our Goliath, at which point Starry would end up falling, and we would need to try to face these bastards on our own. But we never leave one of our own behind, so as the fight continued, we ripped her up out of the ground around and started taking her towards the ship. Even faced with such overwhelming odds and overwhelming putrid enemies, we would not falter. We got Starry to the ship and put her in a cryosleep casket. But the Flood was not finished with us yet, with a ungodly bombardment of carrier forms coming our way. I think it was finally time for us to get the hell out of here. But before we could do so, we had to repair the ship's AI. So we had Azafar begin reconstructing it. As we were doing so, though, the carrier forms made their way into the base. As they were pushing us away from our ship, we began firing at them, trying to retreat so that we could circle back around the base and make our way over to finish the AI, board the ship, and to get the hell out of here, but things started looking pretty grim. We had lost Hiroshi to the parasite. There was no chance of stopping the infection this time, I'm afraid. Even after witnessing the horrific assimilation of our clone brother, the fight must continue. Shin and Rinbim would attempt to distract the parasite, fighting it and trying to keep it off of Asafar's back as long as they could. Finally, thanks to the time that they were able to buy him, we would complete the ship's AI and we could get the hell out of here. Rushing and jumping straight into the cryosleep pods, we had finally made it. Now, let's launch this bad boy. They miss quite a few civilians, but not bad for a simulation. Not bad at all. Howdy friends, I just wanted to pop in here at the end of the video and say thank you. Thank you ever so much for watching this video and also this series, which is actually our very first Winston Wave series. Now, technically there could be some debate whether or not it ended in the very beginning with our first clone dying, but I like to think that this story went exactly where it needed to be, and I hope you all think so too. I had heard about Winston Waves for years, and before this one, of course, we done sort of our Halo, I guess you could call it, series in Winston Wave, so technically maybe this one isn't exactly the first, but it was more of just us messing around with different factions and weapons and stuff like that to see what worked best against the Flood and other enemies that we were facing. So I just wanted to say, though, Winston Waves is a complete blast. If you haven't played with it already, you definitely should give it a try. It really switches stuff up, and the reward system is really dope as shit. If you guys want to see more Winston Wave series, though, on the channel, be sure to let me know, and be sure to give this video some love, the series some love in general, and that'll also help let me know as well, likes and all that great stuff. But once again, thank you all ever so much for watching. I do truly hope that you've enjoyed. I love you. I'll see you later. Goodbye.